The great hall of the palace was filled with voices, music, and shining lights. It was the night of a celebration, and everyone had gathered to see their queen walk through the long aisle. Servants hurried back and forth, ministers whispered, and soldiers stood tall with their polished armor. The queen, Alara, was known for her strength and wisdom. But she was also known for something else that no one dared to say aloud. She was the most beautiful woman anyone had ever seen. Among the guests was a young engineer named Ethan. He was not a soldier, not a minister, not a man of high rank. He was there because he had once fixed an important system in the palace, and his name had been put forward to attend the ceremony as a small reward. Ethan did not think he belonged there. He kept his eyes low, staying near the edge of the hall, hoping no one would notice him. But when the queen entered, something happened inside him. His breath caught. His heart started beating so fast that he thought people around him could hear it. The long blue gown of the queen shimmered under the lights. The silver crown resting on her head sparkled like stars, and her calm steps made the entire hall fall silent. Ethan could not stop staring. He whispered to himself, but his voice was louder than he realized. The words slipped from his lips before he could stop them. "You are so gorgeous. I cannot even speak," he said. The sound of his own voice shocked him, froze. Everyone around him froze too. People turned, eyes wide, staring at him. The hall that had been full of whispers and music was suddenly silent. Ethan felt his legs weaken. He wanted to run. He wanted to disappear into the walls. His face grew hot as he looked down at the floor. He had not meant to say it. It was only a thought, a truth that had escaped him. And then something even more shocking happened. The Queen Alara paused in her steps. She turned her head, and for the first time in many years, the court saw something no one expected. A faint color touched her pale cheeks. She looked away quickly, her lips pressing together as if she did not know how to respond. The queen had blushed. Gasps spread through the crowd. Some covered their mouths, some whispered in disbelief. Never had they seen their queen lose her calm. Never had they seen her cheeks turn red. Ethan stood frozen, his body heavy, his mind full of fear. He thought the guards would drag him away, thought the ministers would demand punishment, but none of that happened. The queen simply continued walking, her face turned slightly away, her pace steady, but slower than before. Ethan could hardly breathe. He replayed the moment in his mind again and again. He had spoken without thinking. He had said the truth of his heart, and the queen had heard it. Not only had she heard it, but she had shown a reaction no one else had ever seen. The rest of the night passed in a blur for Ethan. He stayed silent, trying to make himself small. People looked at him, whispered behind his back, but he avoided every gaze. When the queen finally left the hall, her crown shining as she disappeared through the great doors, Ethan felt his chest tighten. He had ruined himself, he thought. He had spoken foolishly. But deep inside, a small spark lit within him. He could not forget the way she had turned her face, the way her cheeks had turned warm with color. The memory stayed with him like a secret he could never tell. He had seen something no one else had seen. When Ethan left the palace that night, he walked slowly under the cold stars. His hands were still shaking, his mind still spinning. He knew he was just an engineer, a simple man with no place near the throne, yet the words had been spoken, and the queen had blushed. And for the first time in his life, Ethan wondered if the smallest voice, spoken honestly, could change the fate of a kingdom. The days that followed the inspection changed more than Ethan expected. His life, once quiet and unnoticed, was now filled with whispers and strange looks. Some people in the city began to respect him for being chosen by the queen. Others called him lucky, while some believed he did not deserve such honor. Ethan tried to ignore all of it. He wanted only to work, to keep his hands busy and to stay away from attention. But the queen did not forget him. She began inviting him more often to her councils. At first he stood quietly in the back of the room, unsure if he belonged. The ministers and generals talked in polished words that felt heavy and distant. Yet when Alara asked Ethan for his thoughts, he spoke simply and directly. He did not care for politics or pride. He cared only for what was true and useful. One evening, as the council gathered to discuss troubling reports, Ethan noticed the mood was heavy. Scouts had brought news that a rival faction was preparing for war. They spoke of armies moving in the shadows, weapons being gathered, and secret alliances being formed. The ministers debated endlessly, but no decision was made. Finally, the queen turned to Ethan. "What do you see in this?" she asked. The room grew tense. The ministers frowned, some whispering to each other, displeased that the queen would ask advice from an engineer. Ethan swallowed hard. He looked at the maps laid out on the table, then at the worried faces around him. "I see that waiting will only make it worse," he said. "If they are preparing for war, then we must prepare faster. Not with speeches, but with real defenses. The systems I saw on the ships can be improved. The walls of the city can be made stronger. If we delay, we give them the first strike." Silence followed. His words were simple, yet they carried a weight that even the ministers could not dismiss. Some shifted uncomfortably, others looked away. The queen nodded slowly. "Honest and clear," she said. "Sometimes that is all that is needed." From that night on, Ethan's presence at the palace was no longer ignored. He still faced resentment, but he also gained quiet respect. The soldiers in particular began to trust him. They saw how he worked beside them, repairing weapons, teaching them simple tricks to keep machines running smoothly. He did not act as if he was above them, shared their food, listened to their worries, and treated them as equals. Yet with every passing day, the bond between him and the queen deepened. They spoke more often, not only of war and machines, but of small things. She asked him about his childhood, about the streets where he had grown up. He told her of the nights he spent fixing broken lights in the city so children could walk home safely. She listened closely, her eyes soft, as if these stories mattered more to her than all the grand speeches of her ministers. Still, the court began to stir with unease. Some nobles whispered that Ethan had grown too close to the queen. Others feared he would gain influence that did not belong to him. In private, plans were whispered to remove him, quietly and without trace. Ethan had no idea of this. He only knew that each time he stood before the queen, he felt both fear and something warmer that he could not name. One night, after a long day of work on the city defenses, Ethan was called again to the palace. He walked through the great hall, the same hall where he had spoken those reckless words. This time, the queen was waiting for him alone, by the tall windows that looked out over the city. "Do you know what they say about you?" she asked softly. Ethan lowered his head. "That I speak too much, and that I should not stand so near to you." The queen turned to him, her eyes steady. "They say more than that, but what they do not see is the truth. You are honest, Ethan. That is why I ask for your voice when others give me only pride." Ethan looked at her, and for a moment, the world outside the window seemed far away. The city lights glowed like stars, but it was her gaze that held him still. His heart beat hard in his chest, and though he said nothing, he knew she could see what he felt. For a long moment, silence filled the room. Then the queen turned back to the window, her voice quiet. "Dark days are coming. I do not know if I will stand through them. But when I remember your words, I feel stronger." Ethan bowed, his throat tight, his hands trembling. He wanted to speak, to tell her that she was not alone, but the words would not come. Instead, he stood in silence, his heart burning with unspoken truth. The days after the ceremony were strange for Ethan. He returned to his small workshop in the city, hoping to forget what had happened. But everywhere he went, he felt the weight of curious eyes. Some people who had been in the hall whispered his name. Others laughed, saying he was foolish to speak to the queen in such a way. A few admired his courage, though Ethan did not feel brave at all. He kept to himself, working late into the nights, fixing machines and repairing old systems for anyone who could pay him. But in the quiet hours, he would remember the queen's face, faint color on her cheeks, the way she had turned her head. The memory filled him with both fear and wonder. He had not only spoken without thinking, but he had also touched the heart of someone far above him. Inside the palace, Queen Alara was restless. She carried out her duties with the same calm strength as always. But in her private moments, she thought of the young engineer. No one had ever spoken to her so honestly. Ministers praised her beauty in formal words, but they did so for power, not for truth. Soldiers swore loyalty to her crown, not to her heart. Ethan's words had been simple, clumsy, even reckless, yet they had been real. Queen began asking quiet questions about him. She learned that he was a skilled engineer, known for solving problems others could not. He had no family left, and he lived a modest life in the lower city. The more she learned, the more she wanted to see for herself. One evening, the queen arranged to visit the defense fleet at the edge of the city. She insisted that Ethan should join, for she had heard he understood machines better than many of her own officers. The ministers frowned at this, but they did not dare oppose her openly. When the order reached Ethan, he could hardly believe it. He was to meet the Queen again, this time not as a guest at a ceremony, but as someone chosen for his skill. His hands shook as he prepared. He cleaned his tools, brushed the dust from his jacket, and told himself again and again not to speak foolishly. The night of the inspection was clear, the sky filled with stars. The fleet stood ready, silver ships lined in perfect order. Soldiers saluted as the Queen arrived, her presence commanding respect from all. Ethan followed behind nervously, keeping his head down. As they walked along the line of ships, officers explained their work, showing new weapons and defense systems. The Queen listened politely, but when she turned to Ethan and asked his opinion, his voice caught. For a moment he thought he could not answer. Then he saw the quiet encouragement in her eyes, and the words came. He spoke honestly, pointing out both the strengths and the weaknesses he saw. He explained how certain systems could be improved, how simple adjustments could save resources and lives. The officers listened with tight jaws, some annoyed, others impressed. The Queen listened most of all. When Ethan finished, Ilara smiled faintly. It was not the formal smile of a ruler, but something softer. "You see, with clear eyes," she said. "That is rare." Ethan bowed quickly, afraid to meet her gaze for too long. His heart raced, not only because she had spoken to him with kindness, but because her words carried weight. She had seen value in him. As the night went on, Ethan noticed small details. The Queen would glance at him now and then, as if measuring his reactions. Her voice, usually firm, softened slightly when she asked him questions. To others, it may have seemed like nothing. To Ethan, it was everything. By the end of the inspection, he was exhausted but filled with a strange sense of hope. He returned to his small workshop, lying awake in the dark, hearing her voice in his mind. In the palace, Queen Ilara stood at her window, looking out over the sleeping city. She remembered the blush she had tried to hide in the hall. She remembered the honesty in Ethan's voice as he spoke of machines and improvements. She had faced enemies and storms, but this was something she had never faced before. A simple man had shaken her heart, and though she told herself it was nothing, deep inside she knew the truth. His words had not left her, and perhaps they never would. The first signs of war came quietly. Strange shadows moved along the borders, and patrols vanished without a trace. Merchants whispered that armies were gathering in secret, and farmers reported hearing drums in the distance at night. The city grew tense. People locked their doors earlier, soldiers sharpened their swords, and even the ministers began to argue louder in their councils. Then one night, the attack came. Without warning, fire lit up the sky as enemy machines rolled across the fields toward the capital. The walls shook with the first blast, and the streets filled with people running in fear. Bells rang across the city, calling every soldier to arms. Ethan was already inside the palace, working late on defense systems when the alarms began. He ran to the main hall, his chest tight, his heart racing. Soldiers rushed past him, and the sound of metal boots filled the corridors. The Queen stood tall at the center of the command room, calm but firm, her eyes sharp. "They have come sooner than we thought," Ilara said. "We fight here and we do not yield." The ministers argued, their voices high with fear. Some wanted to flee, others wanted to surrender. Ethan stepped forward, his voice steady, though his hands shook. "If we waste time with talk, we will lose the walls. Let me help the soldiers with the machines. I know them better than anyone." The Queen looked at him, and for a moment she said nothing. Then she nodded. "Go. Stand with them. Do not let the city fall." Ethan hurried to the outer defenses. The night was alive with fire and smoke, the air heavy with the sound of battle. Soldiers fought bravely, but the enemy pressed hard. Ethan threw himself into the work, fixing broken systems under fire, shouting instructions to men who barely knew the machines. He climbed towers, pulled burning wires with his bare hands, and kept the defense lines alive when they should have collapsed. At one point, a blast struck near the wall where the Queen herself had come to rally her people. She stood with her sword drawn, her crown shining under the flames, refusing to leave even when danger came close. A second blast aimed straight for her, but before it struck, Ethan ran forward. pushing her aside and shielding her with his own body. The fire burned his arm, and the heat scorched his skin, but the queen was safe. The soldiers who saw this shouted with renewed courage. They fought harder, their hearts lifted by the sight of their queen and the man who had risked his life for her. The city did not break that night. By dawn, the enemy was forced to retreat, leaving smoke and silence behind them. When the battle ended, Ethan lay on the ground, his body weak, but his eyes still open. The queen knelt beside him, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. Oh! For the first time, she did not hide her feelings. Her face was pale with worry, her eyes filled with something deeper than duty. "You saved me," she whispered. "You gave yourself for me when you did not have to." Ethan tried to speak, but his voice was faint. "I could not do anything else. You are my queen." Alara shook her head, her cheeks warm with color even in the smoke-filled air. "You are more than that, Ethan. You are the reason I still stand." The soldiers gathered around, silent, watching their queen and the engineer who had become a hero. In their eyes, the two no longer stood as ruler and commoner, but as something greater together. As the sun rose over the broken city, the people cheered not only for victory, but for the bond they had seen with their own eyes. The story of Ethan and Alara began to spread that very morning, whispered in the streets, carried in the voices of soldiers, and spoken with awe. The queen returned to the palace with Ethan by her side, his steps slow but steady. The war was not over, but the heart of the city had changed. Where there had once been fear, there was now hope. And though no words were spoken between them, both Ethan and Alara knew that something had begun in the fire that could never be undone. The city carried scars from the battle, but it also carried pride. Smoke still rose from broken towers, and many streets were marked with ashes, yet the people stood tall. They had seen their queen fight beside them. They had seen an engineer risk his life without fear. That memory gave them strength greater than stone walls. Ethan healed slowly. His arm was wrapped, and his body ached from burns and bruises, but he refused to rest for long. Each day he walked through the city, helping repair what was broken. Children ran to him, calling him a hero. Soldiers saluted him, as if he were one of their own. Ethan was not used to such attention. He only smiled shyly, keeping his head low, but inside he felt a warmth he had never known. The queen visited him often. Sometimes it was in the palace, sometimes in the streets where he worked. She no longer spoke to him with the distance of a ruler. Her words were softer, her eyes warmer. The courtiers whispered more than ever, but Alara did not care. She had lived years in cold silence, but now her heart was no longer hidden. One evening, she asked Ethan to walk with her in the palace gardens. The night was quiet, the flowers glowing faintly under silver lamps. The sound of water moved gently through the fountains, and the city beyond the walls seemed at peace for the first time in many months. "You have changed this kingdom," Alara said. Her voice carried calm strength, but also something tender. Ethan shook his head. "I only did what I could. It was you who led them. They follow you, not me." The queen stopped and turned to him. Her eyes held his, steady and bright. "They followed because you gave them hope. You did not speak as a soldier or a minister. You spoke as a man who cared. And when you stood before the fire, you showed them what loyalty truly means." Ethan's chest tightened. He wanted to tell her what he felt, the words that burned inside him, but he feared they would sound foolish again. He lowered his gaze, afraid of saying too much, but Alara stepped closer. Her hand touched his uninjured arm lightly. "Do you know what I remember most?" she asked. He shook his head. Her cheeks grew warm, the faint blush returning just as it had the night of the ceremony. "I remember your first words. You said I was gorgeous and you could not even speak. No one had ever spoken to me like that. They praised my crown, my throne, my power, but you saw only me. It shamed me because I did not know how to answer, yet it also gave me strength I had never felt before." Ethan's heart raced. He lifted his eyes to her, and in that moment, he saw not the queen of a kingdom, but a woman standing before him with honesty. The silence between them felt heavy, yet it was not empty. It was full of meaning that needed no voice. The two of them stood there for a long time, neither speaking. The night wrapped around them, soft and endless, and the city lights flickered like stars below. In the days that followed, stories of that bond spread through the kingdom. Some said it was love, Others said it was fate. Ministers tried to dismiss it as rumor, but the people believed. They told their children how a queen once blushed when a simple engineer spoke from his heart. They told how that same man saved her life, and how together they gave courage to an entire city. Years later, the tale had become legend. Songs were sung of the night, fire lit the walls, of the man who carried no title yet stood taller than generals, and of the queen who found in him the truth she had never found in power. Ethan never sought fame, and Alara never cared for glory. What remained was the bond they shared, unspoken yet stronger than iron. And though their story was born in a moment of shame and silence, it grew into something eternal. The kingdom endured not only because of swords and walls, but because of a simple truth. Sometimes the strongest words are those spoken without plan. And sometimes the smallest voice can touch the heart of a queen and change the fate of a world.